So this is part two of my kind of analysis and review of Deep Work by Cal Newport. Deep Work has been one of my favorite books. I read it back in 2016 for the first time. I really liked it, and not only did I really like it, but I've thought about kind of the concepts of it over the years. And so just recently I reread it, and still very good. Which doesn't happen often. A lot of times you reread a book, and the second time it's maybe not as good. And maybe some of that's true for this one as well. But still, some very good points in it that I think are worth mentioning. So my first video covered the introduction and the first three chapters, which are known as part one. And it's kind of the theoretical about why deep work is important and why you should care about doing deep work. So if you're interested in that, go check out that video. And so this part number two of Deep Work, is more of a practical advice on how you can get deep work more into your life and into your schedule and things like that. And it's broken down into 4 rules. And so those rules are: rule number 1, work deeply. Rule number 2, embrace boredom. Rule number 3, quit social media. And rule number 4, drain the shallows. All right. So just kind of looking at those rule titles or rule names, rule number 1 is actually going to be the most important, and it's really the key to deep work, right? Work deeply. So let's dive in and talk about rule number 1 first. All right, to start off with, Cal kind of describes 4 different what he calls depth philosophies. But basically, these are ways to implement deep work into your life. And so the first one he calls the monastic philosophy of deep work. Now, the monastic philosophy of deep work, it's basically eliminate all of your distractions entirely. And he gives examples of some people that are able to do this. Obviously, most of us will never be able to eliminate all of our distractions, indefinitely while we do a certain task. But if you're able to, that's a great way to do deep work, is to just eliminate everything else and go off into your cabin in the woods and do your work. Not practical for most of us. All right, so the next one is bimodal. So the bimodal depth philosophy, he said, works a lot for teachers or people that are in a profession where it's maybe more seasonal. So for teachers, he talked about how, especially college professors, they could focus one semester on teaching, and then maybe the second semester or the summer on doing their research and writing their papers. It's kind of a, split the year in half or something like that, where you're able to spend a good portion of your year doing your day-to-day job, like teaching, and then you're able to spend another good portion of the year going deep onto something that is important to you. And so if you're a college professor, well, that's doing your research, that's writing your papers and things like that. So that works good for that profession. Again, not practical for most of us who work a profession that's maybe not seasonal. And so we don't have kind of a natural break in our professional lives. So the third depth philosophy is the rhythmic depth philosophy. Now, this is the one that's probably going to be the most useful for most of us. And the most practical. So the definition of the rhythmic philosophy of deep work is that we're going to set aside a specific time each day or week for deep work, allowing deep work to be part of our regular routine. So basically what this means is, as part of your regular routine, you kind of pencil in time into your calendar where you're going to do deep work. And so, again, this is the most practical. So for some of us, that might be early in the morning, before the day gets going, before you have to head off to your 9 to 5. Maybe you can set aside a couple of hours, 2 hours, to dedicate distraction-free to whatever's important to you. Now, that might be a side hustle, or it might be something, a work project that you're working on that you really need to focus on. But when the rest of the day starts happening, well, you got meetings, you got chats, you got emails coming in, and you got some other stuff that you got to do for your day job as well. And so it's hard to find that distraction-free time. But if you pencil it into your calendar, well, now you have it there, and it can become part of your routine. Now, maybe it's not mornings. Maybe for you, it's evenings. After the kids go to bed, you're able to get your workout and you're able to put away your device, which is the hard part, especially in the evenings, I think, to put away your device and work distraction free for an hour or two before bed. The other option is, maybe you pick one day out of the week. Maybe Saturday's your day, or maybe Friday is your day where you don't have any meetings scheduled for Friday. You don't have any appointments, and Friday is your day to sit down and do all the distraction-free deep work that you need to get done in that time. Now, the problem with that is, and Cal talks about this later on in the book, but really, realistically, most of us are only able to put in at most 4 hours of deep work, just because that's kind of our cognitive limit. We're just not able to focus that deeply for longer than 4 hours. So if you set aside one day, just know that maybe you're only going to get 4 of those hours out of that day as true, honest, deep work. All right. The last depth philosophy that Cal talks about is the journalistic depth philosophy. Now, this one, to me, doesn't make any sense at all because it's basically fit deep work into your schedule wherever it fits. Now, I don't think any of us are A, that disciplined, or B, can flip that switch like that. And I think in the book he mentions the author Walter Isaacson, how he can be like having a party downstairs on his patio and then secretly head off to his bedroom to work for 20 minutes at a time on his biographies that he's writing. Just kind of seems a little bit unrealistic for most of us. All right, so that covers the 4 depth philosophies. Cal also has another list of 4 things in here, and it's the 4 disciplines of execution. So let's cover that next. So 4 disciplines of execution. All right, number 1 is focus on what's wildly important. So this one's a bit self-explanatory. Basically, pick what's most important and have that be your center of focus for your deep work. Number 2 is act on the lead measure. And basically what that means is there are things that we can measure that we have direct control of. And in my mind, those are inputs. And then there are other things that we could measure that we don't have as much control of, and those would be more outcome related. So for the things that we could measure, we can measure our hours of deep work. So if you work for 1 hour of deep work today, you can measure that. And maybe you set a goal for tomorrow, I'm going to work 2 hours. And the next day, maybe 3 hours. It doesn't have to always increase like that, but those are things that you can measure and you can also really control, right? But you can't control maybe the outcomes of that deep work. So if your goal for today's deep work session was to maybe solve a software bug, that you're working on, that you're responsible for, and you spent that 1 hour of deep work working on it, but you didn't quite figure out the solution, well, that's how it is sometimes. I mean, sometimes things take a little longer than an hour. Sometimes things take 2 hours or 3 hours for you to find the solution. So it's hard to measure things that you can't necessarily control, but you could control the amount of time that you spent doing that deep work. So that's the second discipline of execution. The third is keep a compelling scorecard. So if you're going to pick that lead measure to keep track of, whether that's hours of deep work or whatever the case may be, keep a scorecard of it. And I like this quote here where he says, people play different when they're keeping score. And I think that's true, right? And it kind of goes back to that popular saying that whatever gets measured improves. Now, the fourth discipline of execution is create a cadence of accountability. So set aside time to take a look at that scorecard. If you're measuring something, you're keeping track of it, make sure you set aside time to review it and see how you're doing and see how maybe you could improve for next time. And for a lot of us, that's a weekly review. So just make sure that you have that on your schedule, whether that's Friday afternoon or Wednesday morning, doesn't matter, but make sure you do set aside that time to review at some point. Otherwise, kind of the measuring and the scorecard is all for naught. All right, so he ends rule number 1 by talking about how downtime can actually help us be able to do deep work and be able to concentrate and focus. So at the end of the day, he talks about how, you should shut down whatever work you're doing at a certain point, whenever you're done with work, shut it down and be done. Which is tough for a lot of us, especially with emails on our devices and, things always coming in. That's tough to shut down these days. So he tries to make a point there that it's worthwhile to shut down. And he mentions that oftentimes the work that's done after hours takes a large amount of our attention, but the importance level is very small. And I like this quote to end rule number 1. He says, when you work hard. And when you're done, be done. I like that. All right, rule number 2 is embrace boredom. And kind of what I got out of this chapter is a couple things, right? So first, the ability to concentrate intensely is a skill that must be trained. So, and I think that's important. And he makes the point that some of us think that, when we really need to focus, we can just flip that switch and now we're able to focus. When I really want to get that done, that's when I'm going to concentrate and I'm going to get that done. And usually, those people that think that are not able to flip that switch when they need to, because concentration is a skill that needs to be trained. And if you haven't trained it, well, you're not very good at it. So it's something that should be practiced. And it kind of goes back to the rhythmic depth philosophy, where if you're doing something on a regular basis, well, you're going to get better at it. And so to kind of build on that, he gives this metaphor here. If you eat healthy just one day a week, you're unlikely to lose weight. And then he says, similarly, if you spend just one day a week resisting distraction, you're unlikely to diminish your brain's craving for these stimuli. And so he spends a good portion of this rule or this chapter talking about how, even on our days off or even on the weekend, we should kind of schedule time for distractions. Not that we should avoid distractions altogether, but it shouldn't be the default. We should practice being bored. If you're at the grocery store in the line, you got to wait for the person in front of you. It's okay to just stand there and be with your thoughts and kind of resist that temptation to go pick up your phone. And I think this is an interesting thing that we've gotten so used to grabbing our device. I mean, it is just second nature. It's first nature, really. I mean, that's what we do. As soon as we have to wait 5 seconds, we're picking up our phone and looking at it. And I think this is a good exercise. And I don't know if it's willpower or if it's discipline or something along those lines, where it's just like, let me just sit here. I'll sit here for a minute. Can I sit here for a minute and just, even if I'm just people watching or, whatever, and not grab my phone. I think it's a good exercise. All right, on to rule number 3, which is quit social media. Is YouTube a social media? And I think there's a debate on if YouTube is social media or not. So maybe you can stay on YouTube. Thanks for watching this video. Anyways, it's just a point here that he's making that we do spend a lot of time dedicated to social media. And some people think it helps them professionally. And maybe it does, but what he's asking is that you take a step back and see if there are other ways to spend your time that would help you benefit professionally more than social media. He goes into 2 approaches for tool selection, which I really liked because I've been thinking about this a lot lately, especially as I've been trying to decide if I'm going to move my notes to Obsidian and introduce a new tool kind of into my workflow. So here are his 2 approaches for tool selection. So the first approach is the any benefit approach, where you're justified in using a network tool if you can identify any possible benefit. Now, the problem with this is it ignores all of the negatives. He goes on to say that throughout history, skilled laborers have applied sophistication and skepticism to their encounters with new tools and their decisions about whether to adopt them. And that goes into the next approach, which is the craftsman approach. Identify the core factors that determine success and happiness in your professional and personal life, and then adopt a tool only if its positive impacts on those factors substantially outweigh its negative impacts. So basically what that means is we're spending a little more time, or a lot more time, deciding whether or not we should use a new tool. And in this case, and in this chapter, he's talking about social media as a tool. Like if you're using Twitter professionally to network, and you think that that might be a good way to network and get your name out there, and by tweeting every day, people will see your name. But what he's discussing in this chapter is if networking is important to you, first you have to identify if networking is even, the top of your priorities professionally, because maybe there's other things that might have a higher priority that you should spend more time on rather than networking. But if networking is up at the top of your list, then the second thing you have to ask is Twitter the best approach to that? Or should I go to local meetups or, conferences, or maybe use LinkedIn? Is LinkedIn better than Twitter? So, you have to kind of weigh these things and do a little bit of analysis and a little bit of thinking through, what do I want to spend my time on and what's going to benefit me the most? And is it going to outweigh, like he says on the craftsman approach, substantially outweigh the negative impacts? All right, to close out rule number 3, I liked this quote, and he's quoting an old self-help book from 1910, which is called How to Live on 24 Hours a Day. And the author from that book says, the great and profound mistake which my typical man makes in regard to his day is that even though he doesn't particularly enjoy his work, seeing it as something to get through, he persists in looking upon those hours from 10 to 6 as the day, to which the 10 hours preceding them and the 6 hours following them are nothing but a prologue and an epilogue. All right, on to rule number 4, drain the shallows. To be honest, I didn't even take too many notes on this chapter, because basically what it's saying is take anything that drains your time, things like emails, things like meetings, chats, any sort of work like that, and see if you can't, 1, reduce it, or 1, eliminate it, 2, reduce it, or if you can't eliminate or reduce it, then 3, kind of batch it up into sessions and say, well, I'm going to check my email at 8 a.m. and at noon, or whatever the case may be. But you kind of batch up a time to say, this is when I'm going to do those tasks. Or, if things like meetings, can you reduce the number of meetings that you have? And that's all this chapter is saying. By drain the shallows, he means eliminate or reduce any of the shallow work that you can in order to maximize the hours that you have available for deep work, obviously. All right, and so that's the last rule. And just kind of a couple thoughts to close this out. I do think rule number 1 is the most important, work deeply. But as I was making this video, I realized how important rule 2 is, which is called Embrace Boredom. Maybe the title of the rule needed some work because, yeah, we need to embrace boredom, but really what the chapter went into is how much we need to practice concentration in order to get better at it. And that's kind of what I found, when I try to practice deep work, or when I try to do deep work, I put it on my calendar, I schedule it, like rule number 1 says, and I identify the thing that's most important, also like rule number 1 said, and I know what I'm going to do. And then when I sit down to do it, it's like, I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about that, and it's just because I don't have enough practice. And I think rule number 2, now that I've talked through this, making this video, is almost just as important as rule number 1. Because yes, those depth philosophies are important, and it's important to get it on your calendar. However, just like I've experienced personally, if I get it on my calendar and I do all those things right, if I'm not able to sit down and still do the work that needs to be done because I haven't practiced, because I haven't exercised my concentration, it doesn't help me at all. So I have to be able to deepen my focus, and the only way to get there is to practice it. So those are my concluding thoughts, and to wrap this video up, I'll leave you with one more quote from Deep Work. The deep life, of course, is not for everyone. It requires hard work and drastic changes to your habits. For many, there's a comfort in the artificial busyness of rapid email messaging and social media posturing, while the deep life demands that you leave much of that behind. There's also an uneasiness that surrounds any effort to produce the best things you're capable of producing. as this forces you to confront the possibility that your best is not yet that good. It's safer to comment on our culture than to step into the Rooseveltian ring and attempt to wrestle. Well, that's all for this video. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.